Okay, everyone, I think we can get started. It's the official 5 minutes after the 10:30 starting time. So I'm overwhelmed introducing this woman. She's so famous. She's the president of the APS. She's a distinguished professor at Northeastern, and she is a groundbreaking researcher in the area of emotion. And as we all know, this topic is so cutting edge right now and so politically divisive and just so important for us to hear what the great things about doing research in this area are and effective things about doing research in this area are versus the ways it could be used for harm. That I thought she was in town to get an award, so with the AAAS, right? So we were just so lucky to have her here. So without further ado, I'm not going to say anything because she's going to speak for herself. Okay, Lisa, take it away.
Great. So thank you to Mary for the invitation. What I want to say is I'm going to be presenting things at a pretty high sort of heuristic level. I'm not going into a lot of detail about data or methods, although I'm very happy to answer questions about that. Mainly what I want to do is give you an overall taste of the state of the research as we currently understand it from my lab and basically more generally in the literature. So lots of companies, including yours, are trying to detect how people feel by reading their facial expressions. I think everyone can agree it's a super exciting time. The technology is advancing really pretty rapidly, and there is a growing economy of emotion reading gadgets, apps, and algorithms. But can a machine actually read emotion in your face? Well, there are plenty of companies who claim to have done it already, including yours. But what I'm going to tell you today is that these claims are based on some fundamental assumptions about emotion which are probably wrong. And the message here is not that machines can't perceive emotion or that we shouldn't be doing this. It's really more that companies are going about it, I think, in the wrong way, if the news reports and press releases and published papers are correct. And there is a problem with misrepresenting what you can do because there are possibilities for harm. But as a scientist, I'll also say I see another really important thing to point out, which is that there is a game-changing opportunity here with the technology that you have that if you ask the wrong questions, you will miss. So people have in psychology and related fields have been trying to understand the nature of emotion for 150 years with very little resolution because our ability to collect data and analyze those data in a dynamical systems way and other sort of more complex analytic ways have been, until recently, not possible. And so if we harness the technology to be asking the right questions, which I have to say are hard questions to ask because they are really counterintuitive questions. And that's actually the punchline. Don't claim that you can read anger and sadness and fear in someone's face because you can't. But you do have technology that actually might make that possible. Well, not in the face, but in a person. And so let's just really dive into the details. So most, in fact, all emotion reading technology that I am familiar with usually starts with the assumption that people are supposed to smile when they're happy, frown when they're sad, and scowl when they're angry, and so on. And everyone else around the world is supposed to recognize these frowns and scowls and smiles as emotions, as is technology. And this assumption is what leads companies to claim that when they detect a smile on someone's face, they're actually detecting happiness. Or when they detect a frown on someone's face, they're actually detecting sadness. But I'm just going to give you one small slice of evidence here. These are meta-analytic summaries, so statistical summaries of research. Along the x-axis are the facial configurations which have been hypothesized as universal expressions of emotion. And today I'm just going to concentrate on these 6 categories because this is where most of the research has been done. But everything I'm going to say basically holds for every emotion category that's ever been studied in literature. So how often do people actually make these faces to express the emotion as hypothesized? The answer is actually not so much. So on the y-axis is the proportion of times that, and by the way, this is actually just making any part of that configuration. If the whole configuration is what I would be plotting here, this would be, these numbers would actually be considerably lower, okay? So these numbers are really low. This is the number of studies that were available for analysis. This was published in 2017 and updated in 2018.
Sorry, can you clarify what the graph is showing? I think you stopped mid-sentence when you were explaining. What do those values represent? Like, what does 0.34 mean?
That's what I'm about to explain.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. So this is the number of studies which are available for meta-analysis, and you can see that they're really low, and which I'll explain in a moment. But these are the number of studies where what experimenters did was they observed movements on the face as people were induced in a laboratory setting or in everyday life to experience the emotion. So, for example, when people are angry, they, on average, will scowl 32% of the time. That's significantly different from chance, as is the case for all of these. These are the standard errors. So in all cases, these expressions are observed when expected, more than what you would expect by chance. But 32% of the time is what a scientist would call low reliability. That means approximately 70% of the time when people are angry, they are not scowling. They are doing something else with their face.
And then what is the N? Is that the number of studies about that particular emotion?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So it's true that scowling is an expression of anger, but it is not the expression of anger. And in addition, people scowl when they're not angry. They scowl when they're curious or confused or concentrating or when they have gas. They scowl for lots of reasons, which is what we would call low specificity. So people move their faces in the expected ways, significantly more than chance. That gets you a publication, even in a very good journal. But what it doesn't do is allow you to generalize from these data to looking at someone's face and making a really good guess exactly how they're feeling. So nevertheless, even though that's the case, there are hundreds and hundreds of studies where test subjects are shown these posed faces and asked to identify the emotion being portrayed. And so unlike the studies that observe people's facial movements, studies that ask people to judge the expression in this face, the number of studies available for analysis, this, by the way, was 20 years ago, the last meta-analysis was done. So since that time, there are probably several hundred more studies that have been done. So most of the research that is being used to as the basis for emotion AI actually comes from perception studies where subjects are asked to judge posed stereotypic expressions, which I'll show you a little bit more in a minute. But the important thing to understand is that if you look at those proportions, so on average across 83 studies, 65% of the time people choose, this is anger, this is fear. Yeah, this is anger, this is disgust. So I should have said 0.28, but earlier. But so unlike 3 studies that exist where people's faces were actually observed, there were 83 studies where people were asked to judge this face or a face like this, and 65% of the time on average, they labeled it as angry. So that's quite a difference, right? And companies are using not the white bars, but the blue bars to develop their emotion AI. So how come the blue bars are so much higher than the white bars? Well, here's why. Because in these studies, the typical paradigm is such that you give someone a posed face, and then you give them a list of emotion words, and then they're asked to choose the word that matches the face. So what's the correct word that matches this face? And that gives you a really high, on average across all studies, the average correct response, which is called accuracy. Accuracy, even though these are posed faces, is 67%. That's across all the studies that were in that meta-analysis from 20 years ago. There are many, many more studies like this now, and the results are pretty much the same. And if it feels to you like, reading emotion on a person's face is like reading words on a page, that's because that's in fact what subjects are doing. Because when you remove these words and you just ask subjects to freely label the face, these are Western subjects, okay, from Western urban cultures, the average accuracy drops significantly. This is still above chance. But you can see that just by presenting a face alone, you've really disrupted the finding. And actually, if you use other emotion categories like shame or contempt or embarrassment or compassion, the accuracy rate, the agreement rate drops to chance levels. Now, what happens when we throw a little cultural diversity into things? Well, things get a lot more interesting. So in my lab, we have gone to remote, small-scale cultures. These are cultures where people have very little access to Western cultural practices and norms. These aren't ancient cultures, but they are cultures which where people do live in ways that are similar to the ways that our Pleistocene ancestors lived. So, for example, we went to Tanzania to test the Hadza hunter-gatherers who live in sub-Saharan Africa. They are one of the oldest populations on the planet. They have the oldest mitochondrial DNA on the planet. They've been hunting and gathering really continuously since the Pleistocene. I just want to emphasize again, they're not an ancient culture. They are modern humans, okay? But they do live a lifestyle which is as close to our ancestors as we're going to find. And when we give them these faces, or faces like this, and we ask them to freely label these faces, we see agreement rates drop even more. And the only reason why this is so high is because in these experiments, typically there's only one positive category, smiling for happiness, and then there are all the negative ones. So if you just remove that positive category, then we're pretty much almost at chance levels. So basically, when you start peeling back the pieces of this very standard method that experimenters use to show evidence of universal expressions, as you start to take away pieces of the experimental method, the evidence for universality disappears. And just to show you the power of the method itself, okay, we did an experiment also with the Hadza, where what we did was we found 6 emotion categories from different cultures that have never been claimed to be universal, that don't exist in English, that don't exist in Hadzade, because these were we were going to test the Hadza. We wanted to test the hypothesis that the experimental method that's been used for the past 50-something years is really what's making emotion categories look as if the expressions are universal, even though they're not. So we found these 6 categories, and then we invented expressions for them. We just invented expressions. We just made them up, basically. The study I'm going to tell you about is a study where we made up facial expressions, and we also made up vocalizations. So, for example, for this category, giggle, which is from the Philippines, and it means an overwhelming urge to squeeze or pinch something that's very cute. And so the sound, the vocalization that we made up for this is ee! Okay? And so we just made up these vocalizations plop them into the method, and tested our subjects. And so the method, which has been around since the 1920s, that was invented by a man named John Dashiell. This is the method that Paul Ekman used in his original experiments, and it's really the method that everybody uses. We only used it here, to make a point. Is that, you tell a little story about a person who has an overwhelming urge to squeeze or pinch something that's very cute. So you just give the word and you say, which of these two expressions would this person make? And you play one sound, you play the other, they pick, and then you do it again, over and over and over and over. And guess what? When you do that, 6 categories that have never been claimed to be universal, we can make 5 of them look universal, basically. When you average it out, you get 57% accuracy or agreement, which basically is not statistically different from the accuracy rates that you see for anger, sadness, fear, disgust, and so on.
So you're pitting these categories against each other?
Just against each other, yeah. So I can basically take any, in fact, we could make up a category right now, give it a word, plop it into that method, and make it look universal. Because the method is teaching subjects they are perceptually learning in the experiment to pair whatever features you give the people, vocal sounds, faces, or whatever, with words. And so what I like to say, what I said to Paul Ekman when I originally talked to him about this is, he discovered something really important, actually. It's not what he thinks he discovered, but he discovered something really important, and that is words help people learn emotion categories. And they help people learn the expressive patterns of other people really quickly, actually. And there's something really powerful and important about that. But we're not talking about that today. We're talking about facial expressions more generally, and are they universal, and how can they be used in AI? So if you have questions about the point that I'm making about words, I'd be happy to talk about it later. I just want to get back to this point here that the blue bars, which are the main evidence that scientists use to make claims about universal emotional expressions, really are derived using a family of methods that don't discover evidence for universal expressions. They manufacture that evidence because of what they are teaching subjects during the experimental procedure. And this method, which has been around since the 20s, is pretty much responsible for the scientific belief that a scowl is the expression of anger and a smile is the expression of happiness, and so on. But the point that I want to make today is that if you are a company who wants to build AI to perceive emotion in humans, then you have to pay attention to the white bars. You have to understand, first of all, that these very famous facial configurations don't consistently display the emotions that they are claimed to display. And that instead, if we put all the evidence together, what we understand is that variation is the norm. So let me show you what I mean. If you look at this person's face, how does she look to you? What emotion does she look like she's experiencing? Tired, sad. Yeah, well, Mary's right. Actually, this is my daughter, Sophia, from a couple of years ago. She's on her 2nd chocolate drink at the Chocolate Museum in Cologne, and she is experiencing only what I can describe really as a profoundly deep sense of pleasure. And this little sweetie is also experiencing a profound sense of pleasure. And so the lesson here is that people move their faces in many different ways during instances of the same emotion category. Are these facial movements random? No, they're not random. They are situated. They are situated in an entire ensemble of sensory features, right, and behavioral features. So when I say variation is the norm, I'm not saying that people just do random stuff with their face. I'm saying that we look at each other's faces when we talk, and consciously our attention is on other people's faces. But our brains are actually learning a huge ensemble of sensory cues, of huge pattern, right? We have brains that are pattern matchers, and they are learning patterns. And that's how we're making sense of people's of facial movements. Now, if you look at this little guy's, just his eyebrow region, it's actually, he's scrunching his eyebrows in a way that is very reminiscent of the proposed expression for anger. And this guy, when people look at him, usually he looks totally furious. But when you pan out to see the entire context, you can see that he's actually elated. This is actually, does anyone know who this is? This is actually Jim Webb, who won the senatorial race in Virginia in 2006 and returned the Senate to Democratic control with his victory. I'd just like to take a moment, simulate what that might feel like. I can tell you that when I gave that joke in Iowa, nobody laughed. It only works on the coasts, and then I made a comment about being from Massachusetts, and then they all laughed, so that was fine. Without context, we see his face as being angry because, in fact, this is the face that symbolizes anger in our culture. And so it's not only the case that people move their faces in different ways when expressing the same instances of the same emotion category, it's also that they move their faces in exactly the same way when expressing instances of different emotion categories. The point is that in real life, a face does not speak for itself. In experiments, people see this face as smugness or pride, but actually, it is the proposed universal expression for disgust. And what's really interesting is when you show subjects these, you plop the head on a different body, the facial configuration is identical, but the way that subjects scan the face with their eye movements is very different, based on what they believe, what they're guessing the expression to be. So what's up with these expressions? Like, where did they come from? Well, there's a really interesting story about where they come from, which I don't have time to tell you. But if you ask me the question and answer period, I'll be happy to share it. The general point, I guess, is that they were not discovered by observing how people actually move their faces in everyday life. They were stipulated by a handful of scientists and then adopted as universal truth. And then scientists built a whole science around them. Because almost every study that has ever been published uses faces like this, posed expressions, until very recently, with the advent of being able to capture moment-to-moment facial movements in a much easier way. But basically, these are Western stereotypes. They are Western stereotypes of expressions. So we have basically on our hands a science of emojis, and this is the scientific basis that many companies, in fact, most companies, are using to train their emotion AI with. Yep.
So is there like a public data set that all these companies are using for emotion, or are they collecting their own data in each case?
In many cases, there are existing data sets. In some cases, people are using their own databases that they're developing. They have human coders code the faces using these expressions as, so they're using fax coding, facial action unit coding, so they're coding the movement of faces or the position of the muscles, movements, the position of the muscles, but they are not separating the codes from the interpretation of the codes. So my point is that they'll label things like, instead of labeling, this has, facial action unit 1 and 5 and 8 and 3, they'll say this is actually, I don't know, I don't have them memorized, but like, instead of saying, it's this ensemble of units, they'll say this is happiness, this is sadness, this is anger. So instead of saying this is a scowl, they say this is anger. That one is just descriptive. The other one actually embeds an interpretation.
Do any of them use data where the person themselves who are making the expression label themselves? Because that's something that is done in some, like, in situ labeling of your own emotions.
So you're asking me actually a very good but somewhat complicated question. I can't say what every technology company does. I can say that the majority of scientific studies don't do that. Sometimes they'll do, like, I think one of the best data sets I've seen is from my colleague Alish Martinez. They used words to mine the internet to find images. I think they found something like 7 million images or something like that. So that's actually a really good start. But still, these are curated images. I would say the words actually they were using were translated into many languages, but I think 7 or 8 languages, but they're still American words. Like, they weren't using words that, denote other emotion categories that are not in English, that are, very frequently used. So for example, sometimes people will say to me, well, how often do the Hadza, how often do they, frown in sadness? That's not even a meaningful question, actually. They don't even though they have some of those words in their vocabulary, they were imported from Swahili. They're not Hadzane, words. So they know the words, but they just don't use them. Like, they're just not relevant to them, right? So if this were a different talk, I would tell you about, some of the research that we're doing where, for example, we do something exactly like what you suggested. So, for example, not with faces, the pilot study I'll just mention now is actually with physiological features. So we send people out we wire them up, we send them out into the world do physiological monitoring. I'm going to talk about this study actually at AAAS tomorrow in my address, my award address. And they wear the equipment they come back to the lab, I think it's 14 days, 8 hours a day, 14 days, okay? And we take resting baselines when they're sitting, standing, lying down, just in all sorts of positions. Whenever their heart rate changes from baseline, but they're not moving their bodies, that's a psychological event. And so in that moment, they are triggered to give us the labels of how they feel. Then we use unsupervised machine learning to cluster the physiological features, and then we can look at whether those patterns generalize across people. Do they generalize across situations? Do the labels, correspond to any particular sets of features? Basically, the question you're asking me is in the direction of really what people should be doing. I will say, though, that I don't think that people's own word use is the gold standard here for another reason, and that is that people differ in their understanding of those words. They differ in their understanding of the meaning of those words. So, for example, in other research that I did many, many years ago, this is actually my dissertation, part of my dissertation, we discovered that when some people use the word angry, they mean a pretty distinct experience. When other people use the word angry, they mean, I feel bad. So for them, anger and sad and fear, like angry, sad, and fearful, are synonyms for I feel like shit. Whereas for other people, angry and sad and fearful are distinct. For some people, irritation, frustration, and anger are completely distinct experiences, as opposed to synonyms for anger. So just having people use words isn't meaningful unless you actually understand their conceptual understanding of those words. But that's okay, because that's also a solvable problem. And basically what I'm suggesting is if you want to develop emotion AI, you need to build it on data that is collected about people's emotional episodes as they occur in the real world. In the real world, an emotion like anger or sadness is not an entity. It is a category of instances which are full of variety. Now, this is a technology company, and so for those of you who know about classification systems, you know what a category is. A category is a group of instances which are similar in some way. For example, if you were building a cat recognition system, you would develop a classifier that would learn the features of cats, what they have in common, and to use that to distinguish them from, say, dogs or fish or whatever, right? And so this category, does anyone get the pun? Category? Yeah, that's okay. My daughter maybe put that in. Is a collection of instances that have physical features. Now, there's plenty of variation in this category too, right? Some cats are large. Whoops. Some cats are small. Some cats have different eye colors. They have different thickness of fur when they have fur at all. And the human brain tends to ignore this variation in favor of what cats have in common. But here's the thing. Many categories that we deal with in everyday life are not defined by physical features, by the similarity of their physical features. Take this category, for example. Everyone in this room knows this category. Can you tell me what it is?
Grayish.
Grayish. That's good. Actually, I hadn't heard that one before. That's very good. Yeah, you could say.
These are all things that are gray.
You could say these are all objects that are grayish of some sort. Yeah, that's a feature that's similar. Anything else?
I wouldn't.
One person said these are all objects that can shoot water. I thought that was pretty good.
I was thinking.
Yeah. Or these are things that you cannot bring through airport security. So what does this little exercise tell us? It tells us that, first of all, the human brain is able to do this really amazing thing, and that is with a collection of instances, we can foreground some features and background other features, and we can actually recategorize in the blink of an eye, just remarkably. The other thing, though, is that we can find similarities among objects or instances that are not based on their perceptual features, but that are based on their functional features. This requires the ability to abstract, to do abstraction, which the human brain is not the only kind of animal brain that can abstract, but we have the ability to abstract in spades. And so, excuse me, this category exists in your head. It exists in your head and in the head of every person who's ever flown on an airplane. It's the kind of category that we call social reality. Categories of social reality are categories where we impose functions on an object or an event that they normally wouldn't have by virtue of their physical features. And we have collective agreement about what those functions are. And as a consequence, the thing then really starts to have those functions. Like, can anyone think of an example of social reality? Money is the best example of social reality, right? If you look across the course of human history, all the things that have served for currency share no physical features whatsoever. It's just that at that time, people agreed they could be traded for material goods, and so they could. And when people remove their agreement, they withdraw their agreement, all of a sudden, those things don't have value anymore, right? That was the mortgage crisis. We don't just it's not just money that's social reality, it's the future possibility of having money, right? Yeah. Anybody else? Are you a citizen of a country? What's a country? Countries come and go, boundaries come and go. The land is the same, but the countries come and go. That's social reality. The powers of a president? A president. That's social reality. So, although no one's actually said this, right, what we're watching right now, play out in politics here and in other places around the world, is a negotiation of social reality. When we allow certain things to happen, that's a way of giving consent, of collective agreement, as much as actively doing something. So the point is that much of the world that we live in, that we take for granted, we sort of see it as out there physically in the world, is actually in our own heads, and we're coordinating with each other and expecting certain things to have certain functions, and then they do. And the idea is that this is actually also what emotion categories are. So facial movements and bodily changes and physical actions have physical functions for your body. But their meaning, emotionally, their meaning is social reality. And it changes depending on which culture you're in and who you are. So in one culture, nodding your head has one meaning, and in another culture, it has a completely different meaning, right? By virtue of social reality. It's not like we talk to each other and negotiate what the meaning is. We learn the meaning, and our brains use that meaning in interpreting and guessing what facial movements mean, what physical movements mean, and so on and so forth. So an elephant has no inherent meaning as an object that can't go through airport security. Likewise, a downturned mouth, a scowl, is not an inherently an expression of anger. In this culture, we've learned to construct a category for anger in a variety of situations that transforms physical movements like a scowl or a cry or a stone-faced stare or even a laugh as something that has meaning as anger, that allows us to predict what that person's going to do next. And so the punchline is that perceiving emotion, recognizing emotion, is not a clustering problem. It's actually a category construction problem. Basically, what the human brain is doing is constantly constructing categories. And if you want to be able to, and those categories actually direct the person's action, and if you want to understand what their facial movements mean or what their bodily movements mean and so on, you have to figure out which category they're constructing and how they're doing it. So it doesn't matter whether you're measuring facial movements or vocal acoustics or physiological activity in the body or neural activity in the brain. Physical changes by themselves have no inherent emotional meaning. Somebody or something has to make them meaningful by categorizing them in a particular way. And that's how emotions are made and recognized in other people. So emotions are not built into your brain from birth. They are built as you need them by your brain. To give you an intuition of what I'm talking about here, because this is all happening outside of your own awareness and very automatically, let me give you an example. So, does anyone know what this is? So right now, your brain, billions of neurons in your brain are attempting to make sense of what this is, to guess at what these blobs refer to, so that you can see some image there other than black and white blobs. And your brain is searching through a lifetime of past experience, issuing thousands of guesses that you are largely unaware of, weighing probabilities that you are largely unaware of, trying to find a good answer to the question, what is this most like? Not what is this most like? In my past experience, what is this most like? Now, if you see blobs and your brain is not, hasn't found a really good match, then you are in a state that philosophers call experiential blindness. That you're just seeing random, basically noise, and you can't really make sense of it. Your brain can't really make sense of it. So I'm going to now cure you of your experiential blindness. You ready? Yeah. When I'm talking to really big audiences, especially medical audiences, I stand up and I'm like, are you ready to be cured of your blindness? Mm. Let me do it again. Okay? Now many of you see a bee, or at least part of a bee. So how many of you see a bee or part of a bee? Yeah. Why? Because now when your brain searches your past experiences, you have new knowledge there that you didn't have before. And this knowledge changes how your brain is experiencing these blobs. Your brain is basically categorizing these blobs as a member of the category B. And as a result, you see a bee, even though there is no bee actually there. Right? Nothing on this image has changed from when you saw it before, even though you see it differently now. And if I were to show you this image again in a year from now or 10 years from now, you would still see a bee. And here's the other really cool thing. When I first showed you this image and you didn't know what it was, right? If I had been scanning your brain or measuring your body, your amygdala would be going nuts, not because you were fearful, but because your brain couldn't figure out what this was. And the amygdala, its role really is not the neural basis of fear. It's to alert the rest of the brain to when you need to learn something so that you can better predict later. Your brain can do better prediction. Now that you know that this is a bee, you can categorize it as a bee. If I was measuring your body, if your past experience with bees, if you're a gardener and you have bucolic, you had bucolic experiences with bees in your garden, your heart rate would be reflecting that very calm sense of tranquility. But if you had been stung by bees, if you are afraid of bees, then you're seeing the bee now. Your body would be we'd be measuring a completely different reaction, even though the image is not changed from before when you saw it. But the point is that when your brain actually categorizes, it's not just making meaning in a symbolic way. Those predictions, those categorizations that your brain makes actually direct your body. They direct the physical changes in your body in the way that I'm going to explain right now after I answer this question.
I can imagine that there would be other images that create almost the same pattern, and now you show me some other image of something completely different, some sort of scene outside, and now there's going to be a conflict. It's a bee or it's a mountain scene, and I'm not sure now what I will walk away with.
Yeah, well, actually, what's really interesting is I have a lot of these. They're called Mooney images, and they're just a really interesting way of giving people an intuition of the fact that their brains are, we experience our vision and all of our senses actually as if things are out there in the world and we're just detecting them, but that's actually not really what's happening at all. We're actually partly contributing to our own experience, even though we're not aware of that. So these Mooney images are really useful for that. And I have one that is a snake. It's a blobby image, and then, it's a snake. And I had this woman came up to me afterwards, and she came up to me and she said, you need to tell me what's wrong with my brain. And I'm like, well, I don't know if I can tell you what's wrong with your brain, but sure, she's like, well, I saw the snake for a minute, and then poof, I was back seeing a Louisiana swamp. And I just saw a Louisiana swamp, and I just couldn't get the snake back. And I was like, well, and I should say, she didn't have an accent. So how long have you lived in Louisiana? And she was like, my whole life. And that was the point where I wanted to say, really? Like, wow, what'd you do with the accent? Because there's no accent there. But, but I said, well, here's what's happening. Your whole life, you've lived in Louisiana, so you see the blobs as a swamp. And then I showed you a photograph of a snake for under a minute. So the priors, basically, the probability, right, that this is in your brain, that this is a snake, really is much lower than a Louisiana swamp. And basically, inside your brain, if you were to take your brain's perspective for a minute, I think it's a little easier to understand how this works. Your brain is basically entombed in a dark, silent box called your skull. And it's learning what goes on in the outside world only indirectly by scraps of information that come through sensory channels of the body. Now, these are the causes of things in the world. These are the effects of things in the world. These have been caused by something in the world. But your brain only has access to the effects. It doesn't know the cause. It has to guess at the cause. That's a lot of uncertainty, right? And ditto for the body. Your brain receives sense data from your body. Those are the effects of some internal drama going on that your brain doesn't know what caused them. So your brain gets the effects, and it has to figure out what the causes are. So it has all this uncertainty. How does it guess? How does it know? Well, it has one other source of information that it can use. It has a reverse inference problem to deal with. All the time, your brain basically has this reverse inference problem. How does it solve it? Well, it can conjure in its wiring past experiences. Notice I didn't say retrieve, because your brain doesn't store memory and it doesn't retrieve memory. Those are really unfortunate words. It reinstantiates memory. It implements memories. And so any given sensory input can have a range of meanings, but in a given context, your brain can use past experience to make a pretty good guess about what the causes are of these sensations. So this is how an ache in your stomach could be anxiety if you're at a doctor's office waiting for a test. Or it could be hunger if it's dinner time. Or it could be a gut feeling that the defendant is guilty if you are in a courtroom. Your brain basically solves its inherent reverse inference problem by asking the question, how are these sense data similar to something that's happened in my past? How is it similar? Remember what I said about categories. Categories are a collection of things which are similar in some way. So basically what your brain is doing is your brain is generating ad hoc categories all the time to make sense of sense data. And if there were more time, I could show you that these categories aren't just abstract things. They are action plans. They are plans for regulating the internal systems of your body, and they generate the sensations that you experience and even the feelings that you have. So basically, your brain is constructing your experiences and guiding your actions by using past experience and forming ad hoc categories. I was going to say more about that, but I'm running out of time, and so I just want to skip to the end if I can find my cursor, which I seem to, there it is. Whoop. So emotions are not your reactions to the world. They're your constructions of the world. Or more precisely, they're your brain's understanding, its categorization of what is going on in the body, like an ache, in relation to what is happening in the world, like being in a doctor's office or in a courtroom. The emotions that you experience are basically brain guesses forged by billions of neurons working together. So the emotions that seem to happen to you are actually made by you. Categorization is also how you see emotions in other people. Your brain remembers your past experiences from similar situations to make meaning of the present. So instead of making meaning of blobs, you're making meaning of the raise of an eyebrow or the curl of a lip. So to perceive emotion, to recognize emotion, your brain is categorizing the person's facial movements and their bodily movements and the acoustics of their voice and their surrounding context, which also includes, your own body. Your body is a context you carry around with you everywhere you go. You don't experience it that way, but that's how your brain works. From your brain's perspective, you have your own little internal context which goes everywhere with you, and is influencing your perceptions and your actions, even though you are largely unaware of it. So this is how a person's scowl in anger, a scowl can be anger, or it can be indigestion, or it can be confusion, or it could be amusement. So the emotions that you seem to detect in other people come partly from inside your own head, just like all of your vision does, and all of your hearing does, and all of your sense of smell, and every sensation that you have, partially from the world and partially from your own head. So this is how a single physical feature can take on multiple emotional meanings in different contexts. So the punchline really here is, if you want to build a machine that can perceive emotion in another human, then it has to be trained on something more than stereotypes, and it has to capture the full context in high-dimensional detail, not just a face, or a face and a voice, or a face and a body movement. We congratulate ourselves when we, measure more than one signal, maybe 2 or 3, but we really need to be aiming for very high-dimensional measurement, including other aspects of the context and our own bodies, and in a temporally meaningful way, because part of the context is also temporal here. We're dealing with dynamical systems. And I want to point out that when I'm using the word context, as I said before, I'm using the word really, really liberally here, okay? Because context includes not just our own bodies, but also the bodies of other people that we're interacting with. So one of the fundamental things that we, when we're measuring emotion we want to measure someone's facial movements or what have you in order to infer their emotions. They're usually not by themselves. They're usually in a social context. We are social animals. That means a lot of things, but one of the things it means is that we regulate each other's nervous systems without even realizing it. We evolved this capacity as a species. It's one of our major adaptive advantages as a species. And that means that the other people around that person, not only their movements, but actually what's going on inside their body may also be a relevant context for us to be measuring. So we want to measure physical changes and actions that are not only in the person of interest, but in the surrounding social context, because those may be relevant forces or contributors to that person's movements. Now, I was going to talk then about, move from talking about perceiving emotion to experiencing emotion, and whether or not it's possible to build machines that can experience emotion. I'm just going to actually curtail this discussion by making the point that if you were interested in having this discussion, I know some people are interested in building sentient agents and or agents that humans interact with, who, there's an interest in endowing these agents with emotion. The important thing to realize is there are a number of ingredients that you'd have to consider, including giving the agent a set of priors, having the agent be able to take in a large portion of the context, and understand really what what emotions are for, really. Actually, what all experiences are for. And I guess the punchline here, I was going to sort of walk you through this talk about various points, but the punchline is this. Your brain, every brain on this planet, did not evolve to think and feel and see. Brains evolved to control bodies. Your brain is a complex system that controls a multitude of systems in your body. That's what your brain is for, amongst other things. It's at least one of the things your brain is for, right? Brain does lots of things. But it sees and it feels and it thinks in the service of regulating the body. So if you want to build an agent that can experience emotion, it has to have something like a body to regulate. I don't mean literally a corporeal body. I mean a bunch of systems that have to be regulated, because that's actually what your brain is doing. That is the origin of your feelings. The origin of your feelings your feelings come from your brain's relentless, ongoing, predictive regulation of the body. Yep.
I feel like that, situating the experience of emotion in the brain's regulation of the body like that, I'm concerned that that has ableist assumptions in that, for example, someone with disabilities that severely impact their body, are you implying that they no longer experience emotion correctly? Because
here's what I'm saying. No, what I'm saying is that your brain, that's not at all what I'm saying.
Okay.
And I wouldn't suggest that. But here's what I will tell you, that your brain is basically, there are lots of ways to talk about what your brain is doing when it does category construction. You could say it's simulating. You could say it's making perceptual inferences. You can say it's remembering. You can call it lots of things. You could say your brain is running an internal model. It's running an internal model of your body in the world. It actually is anticipating what's going to happen next. That's what those categorizations are. They're like preemptive. Basically, your brain is, if you were to hold everything constant right now, based on the current sensory array, your brain is making a prediction about what's going to happen next. Those predictions actually are preparations to see, preparations to feel, preparations to move. And all the sensory information from the world and the body is doing is either confirming those predictions or changing them. Actually, this is the part that I skipped over because I was running out of time. So if you, as long as you have an internal model of your body, you don't actually need a body, really. Because you have the capacity to have experiences of the body, even though you may actually not receiving any ascending input at all. So, for example, if you have an accident that leaves you partially paralyzed, or cuts the spinal cord at a place where there's not a lot of ascending information that can make it to your brain, you will still experience. Your brain will still can still make sensations. It's just making them mostly out of its own predictions. That's what phantom limb pain is. That's what chronic pain is. Chronic pain. People who are in chronic pain are feeling pain. I mean, you don't feel with your body, you feel with your brain. You don't see with your eyes, you see with your brain. If you take your pulse, you don't feel your pulse in your finger, you feel it in your brain. Everything you experience is in your brain. So if you once had tissue damage, that you had some kind of damage to your body, and your body sent nociceptive input to your brain, and your brain learned that damage was there, and you feel pain. Then as the damage heals, sometimes it happens that the brain doesn't get the message, and it continues to run an internal model as if there is tissue damage when there is no damage. That person continues to feel pain even though there's no tissue damage anymore. That's chronic pain. Chronic pain is a brain disease where people are running an internal model of the brain hasn't updated itself. That may be what certain types of depression are as well. So And I will say every mood disorder that has ever been identified, whether it's part of a mental disorder or a physical disorder, has something to do with a metabolic disruption in regulating the body. I'm not reducing feeling to regulating the body. I'm saying your brain is always regulating your body. It's running kind of a budget for your body. It's not budgeting money, it's budgeting glucose and salt and water and all the nutrients that your body uses. And it's doing this on a regular basis. And we're not talking about one system or two systems. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of little systems. So you can think about your brain like being the financial office of a very large company. And while this is happening, your brain is sending sense data back to your body. But you don't experience that, back to your brain, but you don't experience that for the most part. Because if you did, you'd never pay attention to anything outside your own skin ever again. We're not wired to experience every little piece of sense data. So instead, like right now, you're sitting there calmly, but you don't realize inside your own body, you have a drama going on of, epic proportions. What evolution gave us instead was simple feelings of affect, feeling pleasant, feeling unpleasant, feeling calm, feeling worked up, feeling like shit, feeling comfortable. These are the affective feelings or mood that are directly a consequence of your brain's managing of your body budget. They aren't emotion. They're with you every waking moment of your life, because every waking moment of your life, your brain is regulating your body, and every waking moment of your life, your body is sending information back to your brain. If you can no longer sense your body, you're still feeling affect because of the way that the architecture in your brain, because of the way that it does this automatic categorization. I can totally unpack that for you, but it'll take another hour. The point is that sometimes when... So if you think about affect as kind of a general barometer of like how your body budget is doing, sometimes it's, affect is very intense. And in those moments, that's when our brain categorizes them as emotions. At other times, we can ignore affect, or we can categorize it as something else, like some asshole who, cuts you off on the highway. The assholeness is in that person, right? It's not really. It's actually your affect. You're just categorizing it as part of your perception of that person. So my point here is not that robots and other agents have to have a literal corporeal body. What I'm saying is they have to have a set of systems. They need a balance, keep in balance, and then they have to do it in an energy efficient way. And because those are the requirements that your brain is working under. It has to regulate a bunch of systems. It has to do it in an efficient way. The most efficient thing is to do it predictively, which is really how your nervous system is structured. I had a lot more to say, but I started to, anytime I start to just go off script, I run out of time. So thank you for your patience.